he bought two Mitchell Garcia rod and reels. They were identical, open reels, so you open the bail, you cast. I like open reels, but the problem is that if you've got a little kid using it, before you know it, you've got like a big ball of string, and there's just not any fixing certain kinds of things because life makes some complicated relationships. And David and Absalom's relationship was complicated. In this case, you remember that David's oldest son, Amnon, had raped his half-sister Tamar some years earlier, and Absalom was the full brother of Tamar, so Amnon raped Tamar, and David didn't do anything about it. And, Absalom was really furious that his dad didn't do something to Amnon. So when the time came, a couple years later, Amnon plotted Absalom plotted Amnon's death, and so he got Amnon killed. And David is now ticked off at Absalom for having done this. So Absalom flees the country. He and his sister Tamar go and live in another country over on the eastern edge of the Sea of Galilee called Geshur, where their grandfather had been a king. 3 years goes by, and there's no relationship. Now, Absalom is basically the next in line to be the king. So for, your prince to be over there in a foreign country like that is not a good deal. So Joab makes a plot to get Absalom restored. Absalom comes back, but David says, I'm not going to see the guy's face. 2 years goes by, David won't talk to him. So Absalom is getting furious, and Joab makes a plot to try to get David and Absalom see face to face, and they do, and they kiss, but things are not right. And all of this is a brewing, bitterness that Absalom has. And David has brought Absalom back, but that didn't work out. It just led to a series of tragedies. Here in chapters 18 and 19, we're going to see two more of these tragedies. And the first one is going to be that Absalom comes to a really, really violent death. And David doesn't handle it very well. Now, I think in terms of a lesson, and we're going to kind of camp out on this at different points, a lesson in this would be that no matter what life brings, what we probably do best to do is to try to make our thoughts and decisions driven by what the Word of God says. That's kind of, I think, an idea here that I'm going to camp out on quite a bit. Go to what the Bible says, look at the commandments of the Bible, and if you don't have commandments, look to the principles of the Bible. Try to let everything you do be driven by this is what God says is good and right. Now, when you do that, everything's always going to work out right. Right? No, we don't have any guarantees that everything's going to work out right in this life because it's a fallen world. But probably the best thing, I think, is try to know what God says is good and right. And when you pray, this is how I will often pray. I will pray for God to intervene in a situation. And it may be, a really, difficult kind of situation. But you can pray that God would work what in His eyes is good and right. That's a very safe prayer. Lord, I'm asking you to do what you know is good and right. You think about complicated situations, Israel and Israel's enemies. Is Trump have a good motivation for trying to somehow bring peace between Israel and Israel's enemies? Well, that's a noble goal. Whether or not he's doing it for the right motivations or not is questionable. I think he does a lot of good things, but is he just trying to get a badge that says I brokered a peace agreement? They just Iran just struck a bunch of missiles on Israel over the last few hours. So this peace treaty that's been getting floated out there that may not be lasting very much longer. But how do you solve that one? Well, the only resolution for that is Jesus has to come and do what He knows is good and right. And that's going to be the blessing of having Christ bring His kingdom, is that eternal God is going to be calling the shots. So making decisions that are based on God's word. David, as you trace his life from 1 Samuel onward, we can see that David, he was pretty good at doing that. God brings him King Saul in two situations where David could easily have taken Saul's life, and Saul was actively trying to kill him in the process, and God gave David two opportunities to do it, and David says, I am not going to lay my hand against God's king, not going to do it. So he had an extremely tender conscience about doing what is right. But, we know that he didn't do this perfectly consistently, in particular when he stole another man's wife and had her husband murdered to cover it up. And that really set things in motion. Here in verse 18, chapter 18, verses 1 to 18, we come to another tragedy that David had to endure, and it was the death of Absalom. So David has his faults, and like you and I have our faults. David made some bad decisions, but there are times when you can even want to do the right thing. You try to do the right thing, and it doesn't work out. You go, man, I was just trying to, bring these two people together in a peaceful, restoration. I was trying to do this or that, and it doesn't work out, and you go, wow, I tried. This is what we see with David. He had his faults, but he did have a tender heart. 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 14, back before David became king, God said to King Saul, your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. David was a tender-hearted man. He loved what was good. He loved God, and he loved the character of God, the nature of God. He loved, things like truth and integrity and justice and mercy and compassion. Well, right now, we're going to see how he responds when it comes to the death of his son. In verses 1 to 18, for lack of a better way of outlining it, there's 8 unfolding steps that lead to the death of Absalom. And it starts here in verses 1 to 2, where it says, David numbered the people who were with him and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. And David sent the people out, 1/3 under the command of Joab, 1/3 under the command of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai, the Gittite. And the king said to the people, I myself will surely go out with you also. So David loves his son Absalom and is heartbroken over, the broken relationship and everything that's going on. But here's the issue. You're the king, and your son is trying to murder you and destroy the kingdom. You can't let this happen. So David says, okay, we're going to fight, and he sets up his armies, and he's ready to go to battle against Absalom. The place where they're at, as you remember, is a place called Mahanaim, which if you went to the eastern edge of the Jordan Valley, kind of the northeast edge of the Jordan Valley, that would be the place where you had this town called Mahanaim. We don't know how much time has passed since David was driven out of Israel into that area, and it was a really remote and heavily forested area. Today, 3,000 years later, there's been a lot of people living in that part of the world, a lot of stripping of forests, and so it's not as thickly forested as it was back then. But apparently, as you read what's going on, it was a super, super thickly forested area. And it's been long enough. David has been driven out, and it may have been only a matter of days or weeks, but David has now been able to settle in and say, okay, we're going to fight a war right here. And his first priority was to organize his troops, just like he did right here. And he put them into 3 different companies, which was a pretty common strategy back in the ancient world. His 2 nephews, Joab and Abishai, each have command of one of those companies. And then the third one is a guy by the name, a Philistine, by the name of Ittai, the Gittite. We happen to have, from archaeological records, we happen to have pictures of Ittai the Gittite, and we have recreated him up here on the entrance of the church. When you walk in, you can see this big Philistine over there. Okay, that was pretty funny. Ittai the Gittite. Gittite. What kind of people? What people? Kind of people are Gittites? They're Philistines from Gath. Gittite. Well, who else came from Gath? Goliath. Yeah. So Ittai the Gittite, who is a really highly trusted captain in his army. I mean, David has entrusted him with 1/3 of his army. He's entrusting himself to a guy that came from Gath, where Goliath is from. So this guy has shown himself to be extraordinary in terms of character, that David, would trust him in this way. But he was a very loyal, dedicated now to the people of Israel. Verses 3-4, here we see a second step. The people said, David, you should not go out, for if we indeed flee, Absalom's army will not care about us. Even if half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore now, it is better that you be ready to help us from the city, Mahanaim. Then the king said to them, whatever seems best to you, I will do. So the king stood beside the gate, and all the people went out by hundreds and by thousands. Well, David wanted to go out in battle, but the captains and all the soldiers said, now, this is not a good idea, because you're the guy that they want to kill. And, if things don't go well, they're not going to stop as long as you're alive. Well, as we see right here, David wisely listened to his advisors. It's too bad that he had not asked people advice on some earlier things, Hey, do you think it's a good idea for me to go there and bring Bathsheba into my palace? Are you crazy, you moron? But anyhow, that's what happened. David did listen right here. And, when we talk about listening to advice, I would say this, that, the best thing that we can do to make wise decisions is, first of all, be walking with God. Because if our life is not right with God, let's just suppose that you're talking about an unsaved person, and their life is a mess. Oh, my life is a mess. What am I going to do? It's like, okay, best thing you can do, you need to get right with God. You need to put your faith in Jesus Christ. I think that is absolutely number one. You need to trust in Christ, and you need to walk with him. And the Bible talks about, trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding, in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. That's number one, is being right with God. Number two is you go to the scripture, you say, what does the Bible command about this particular situation? Well, what commandments did God give about a king going out to lead his army in battle? It really doesn't, I don't think, give a commandment about that. But as you go beyond the direct commands of the Bible on whatever it is, you can then look at the principles involved with it. And that's what David's captains are doing. They're saying, okay, this is not good, and here's the principle. If you're here, they're going to never stop until they kill everybody and get you. And that brings us to a fourth principle, and I'm going to kind of recap these at the end, but it would be listening to the advice of other people. That's a smart thing to do. Now, if I were to ask a poll of us in here on something like how do we solve the problems in the Middle East, there would probably be a variety of answers, and you might hold your conviction very strongly. No, this is the best way of doing it. But you probably would have at least two or more different viewpoints on that, right? Which one is right? Sometimes we don't really know what the best option is, but here's the thing. When you listen to the advice of other people, what happens is you can bring information in to help you think things out. And when you make your final decision, you say, I think this is the best advice right here, and you act upon it, it may not work out well. We don't have guarantees in life that everything is going to work out well. But if you're listening to the advice of smart people, hopefully saved people who understand biblical principles, then you can get information to help you think things out, okay? And in this case here, that's what David did. Verse 5 is a third step towards Absalom's destruction. The king charged Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, deal gently with my sake for the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king charged all the commanders concerning Absalom. Then the people went out into the field against Israel, and the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. Well, that's an interesting military command. Don't deal harshly with the guy that's trying to kill me and lead a coup and steal the kingdom. Not good thinking. His emotions are obviously, keeping him from thinking well. It is his son. We can understand that, but, he's not thinking. That was a ridiculous order to your army. But once again, what it kind of does, it does give us a little bit more of insight into David. His son is trying to kill him, and yet he's hoping somehow maybe I can win him over. That maybe would be something that some of us would try to do. Could be, because you love your son or daughter so much, and you just desperately want to have, some restoration. So I think it was really stupid what he told his army, but this is the kind of the complications of life in a fallen world. David does love his son Absalom. Well, everyone heard the king's order when they went out into battle, and it calls it the forest of Ephraim, which apparently was heavily forested back at that time. But it's interesting that it's called the forest of Ephraim because which tribes were on the eastern side of the Jordan River, Jordan Valley? Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh. So half of Manasseh stayed on the western edge of the Jordan Valley, but Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh. So Ephraim's tribal inheritance was not technically on the eastern side. So for whatever reason, back then, it did, obviously it did because it's right here in the Bible, but it called it the forest of Ephraim, okay? But I'm not trying to solve this question, just point it out to you if you say, why is that? But this would have been over there on that eastern edge of the Jordan Valley, and it was a heavily forested area. Verse 7, here's another step towards Absalom's ruin. The people of Israel were defeated there before the servants of David, and the slaughter there that day was great, 20,000 men. For the battle there was spread over the whole countryside, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword. So it was a massive slaughter. 20,000 people got slaughtered that day. That's huge. But it says the forest devoured more than the sword. How is that? Well, apparently it was. No, it is. I mean, you're talking about, near the Jabbok River that flows into the Dead Sea. It's really, really treacherous terrain. And, we can think about something, maybe if you want to think about our own region with something like Ute Pass and, big cliffs. Or think about trying to do battle somewhere like Gunnison, the Black Canyon of the Gunnison, And it's a really treacherous area with thick forests. So what it says right here is this. It was a very, very bad place, especially for Absalom's army. David had a really big tactical advantage because they had settled in there, and apparently they had, it looks like, maybe a slight home court advantage, even though that wasn't their hometown. But the people of that area that were fighting with David knew the ravines and gullies and everything else. No doubt, a lot of people got killed on both sides, but David's tactical advantage gave him a big victory, and it was following wise military advice. do what you can to make wise decisions. Verse 9, Absalom goes out to battle, but he gets caught in a real hairy situation. Now, Absalom happened to meet the servants of David, for Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head got caught fast in the oak. So he was left hanging between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him kept going. When a certain man saw it, he told Joab and said, "Behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak." So Absalom's trying to get away, riding through these thick forests. And you remember what it said about Absalom, that, he was really, really a handsome guy, and then he had this massive head of hair. It looked like, some kind of a, big rock star with this giant head of hair. And it said that when he cut his hair once a year, how much did the hair weigh when he would get his annual haircut? 5 pounds of hair at his annual haircut. So, he's trying to get away from David's army when his soldiers have been wiped out, and he's going under an oak tree. And it says his head got caught in the tree, but in all likelihood, it's connected with his hair. So, the guy is now stuck, and he can't do anything about it. And one of David's soldiers comes upon him and looks and sees him hanging there. But this guy is not about to kill David's son, because everybody was there to hear David give the order, "Don't kill my son. Deal gently with him." So he goes back to Joab, and he gives the report back to Joab and says, "Hey, I found Absalom. He's stuck." And this probably was not very far away. Well, this soldier was not about to kill the king's son, but Joab is not about to let him get away. So verse 11, Joab said to the man who had told him, "Now behold, you saw him? Why then did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have given you 10 pieces of silver and a belt. You could have been a national hero. You would have had, my praise, the leader, the general of all of David's armies, and 10 pieces of silver probably would have been something around the line of a year's wages. You idiot. Why did you let him go?" Well, the guy answers back, verse 12, "Even if I should receive 1,000 pieces of silver in my hand, I would not put my hand out against the king's son. For in our hearing the king charged you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, 'Protect for me the young man Absalom.' Otherwise, if I had dealt treacherously against his life," and there's nothing hidden from the king, "you yourself would have stood aloof. Look, if I had killed him, David would be furious at me, and you wouldn't have stepped up to help me." And, Joab doesn't say, "Oh, yeah, I would have, helped you," because he probably would not have, Fact is. But, this guy is not going to go against King David. Verse 14, Joab says, "I'm not going to waste time with you. Get out of my way." So he took 3 spears in his hand, and he thrust them through the heart of Absalom while he was alive in the midst of the oak. And 10 young men who carried Joab's armor struck him, gathered round, and struck him and killed him. And so Joab goes up, stabs him. When it says it stabbed him in the heart, probably didn't kill him. Probably what happened is he just gave him one good stab so he could have a shot at it. They probably chopped his hair off, let him fall to the ground, and then all of these other guys came up, and they just had their opportunity to vent on him. Now, quite honestly, if I were a soldier and in that situation, I could see myself doing that if I were a soldier and just captured somebody that was that bad. Maybe you would say, "Oh, I could never do that." Now, some of you have been in the military and probably had to do those things, okay? This is the harsh reality of, wickedness, evil, and life in a fallen world. When you're fighting for a cause, you've got to do what's got to be done. Anyhow, I'm just kind of rambling on this point right here. These guys really gave it to Absalom, and made sure he was dead. Absalom had been a massive threat to the kingdom. Joab did what had to be done. Here's the problem that we're going to see. David had been so overcome with personal emotions about his son, he couldn't do anything. He couldn't do the right thing. Remember, he's already lost 2 sons, right? European style. One, he lost his little baby that he and Bathsheba had conceived. 2, he lost Amnon when Absalom killed Tamar, or raped Tamar. And now 3, that's 3 sons that he's lost. But as one writer puts it, bloodthirsty Joab was not so reluctant, and he thrust Absalom in the heart with his javelins, and then the 10 attendants made sure to get the job done. There was if you remember, there was a video, it was called the 180 movie, made by Ray Comfort. And Ray Comfort's a preacher down in Southern California, goes out, does a lot of evangelism in the beach areas, on the piers and that kind of thing. So when he's done some of these outreach and evangelism, he'll try to get people thinking about the principles of right and wrong, about ethics. And so in that 180 video, he's asking people, if you knew, if you had the chance with Adolf Hitler, and you were back then, and you knew what Hitler was doing, would you have killed Adolf Hitler? And a lot of people said, no, I don't think I'd do that. Others said, yeah, I would have put a bullet in his head if I could have had the opportunity. One guy who was, I think, probably a survivor from Poland of the Nazis, he said, oh yeah, I'd put a bullet in his head, I'd put a bullet in his mother's head, I would do anything to keep that guy from existing, because he had to live through and see what was happening. Well, that's what Joab did with Absalom. Now here's the point. We need to try to make wise decisions based upon truths from God's word. Number 1, be right with the Lord, because you're not going to make very good decisions if your heart is not right with God. Number 2, make decisions based upon direct commandments of what your situation is. Number 3, going a little further beyond that, make decisions based upon principles that relate to what you're talking about. Number 4, listen to the advice of other people. Listen to wise counsel. Number 5, always be in prayer about this, okay? Now, if you say, gee, I don't even know how to pray in this. Well, here's a good prayer. Oh God, you know what is good and right. I pray that you would guide me to think your thoughts. I pray that you would bring about the right path in this difficult situation. So you can always pray for God to work, even if you don't know what it is. Joab is making a good decision to stop murderous Absalom. Verse 16, here we see a 7th step out of 8. Now Joab is already dead, but I still have this as part of the unfolding steps. It's time to stop all the fighting and give Absalom the ignoble end that he brought upon himself. So Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing Israel, for Joab restrained the people. They took Absalom and cast him into a deep pit in the forest, and erected over him a very great heap of stones. And all Israel fled, each to his tent. See, with the death of Absalom, it's all over. And that would have also been true if David had gotten killed. It'd be all over. So Absalom's dead. And I don't know what would happen if somebody put a bullet in Putin's head. There may be enough people behind the whole thing that it'd still keep going on. But I suspect that if somebody took out Vladimir Putin, that might put a stop to what's going on in Russia right now. Seems like that's what happened with Hitler. They had to get Hitler out of there. I don't know. I think it's really strange the way that one person can become such a mobilizer of forces. That is strange, but that's the way that it works. So with Absalom's death, the war is over. they blast the shofar trumpet, and that's how you would tell people what to do. I mean, you couldn't get on your cell phone and say, okay, here's end of the war. You blast your trumpets with different kinds of blasts, and that's how you would communicate. But what about Absalom? Well, they took him into a deep pit in that forest, cast him into a pit, threw a giant pile of rocks over him, and left him, and he probably was never, ever found again. And quite honestly, that's what he deserved. One writer says, could have been a cave or some hole in the ground. Some think that the heaping of stones on Absalom was symbolic of the stoning penalty for a rebellious son. But the bottom line is, this is a sad end for a wicked man. Now, if you had gone through Absalom's life, there might have been things where you say, he was a pretty nice guy. Yeah, I liked him, and he was furious at, Amnon and David not doing anything about it, and so he took a stand for what was right. You might have looked at his whole life and say, yeah, I kind of like the guy. And this is kind of funny the way it is in life at any place or any time. There may be people you say, this guy really caused a lot of problem, this particular person. And yet, if you look at other situations, you might say, but he was not that bad of a guy. But that's just the complications of life in a fallen world. Sometimes the way things unfold, it's interesting. In any case, he's gone. Verse 18, here's the final comment about Absalom that kind of gives us a little last insight about Absalom. It says here in verse 18, now Absalom, in his lifetime, had taken and set up for himself a pillar which is in the King's Valley. The King's Valley, we believe from historical studies, if you were looking directly across to the east from the city of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, you have the Mount of Olives, okay? You go down through the Kidron Valley, and then there's the Mount of Olives. And then if you kind of just go a little bit south on that Mount of Olives, the Kidron Valley is in the bottom, and then you have what's called the Hinnom Valley runs into it, and also one called the Tyropian Valley. So these three valleys kind of come together. And, from the Temple Mount, this is like only a mile away. If you just go right across, and you can see on the side of the hill, that was called the King's Valley. And that is where Absalom, prior to this, had made himself some kind of a giant altar for a memorial, because he said, I have no son to preserve my name. So he made a pillar after his own name, and he called it Absalom's Monument to this day. Well, this guy's a little bit into himself. That does indicate here he wants some kind of name and reputation. Now, there is, if you go over to on the other side of the eastern edge, there is something that is there today called Absalom's Monument. That particular one was not put there until basically about the time of Herod the Great, around the time of Christ. So that particular monument that you can see that is there today was not the same one that had been put there by Absalom 1,000 years earlier. However, I would say it's pretty likely that what Absalom had placed there might have gotten torn down in different situations or whatever, and I don't know who restored that thing, but they probably put it in the same place. It's just not the same exact one that had been there earlier. Now, if you were looking back in chapter 14 of 2 Samuel, it said that Absalom had 3 sons. We don't know what happened to those 3 sons, because when he set up the altar, he said, I don't have anybody to carry on my name. So he had 3 sons. Maybe they had gotten killed in battle, or we don't know what happened. But in any case, he didn't have a male heir. Nobody carried on his name, and he ended up getting thrown into a pit in the middle of nowhere. And that's the end of Absalom. Now, we come to chapter 18, verse 19, and we're going to go up through chapter 19, verse 8, kind of rounds out the section. What you see here is David's response to what has happened, because David lost it. We can understand the sorrow of losing a child, But this thing was really kind of off the chart because Absalom had been a major threat to the kingdom of Israel. And David was not handling it well. Verse 18-19, then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, please, let me run and bring the king news that the Lord has freed him from the hand of his enemies. But Joab said to him, you're not the man to carry news this day, but you shall carry news another day. However, you shall carry no news today, because the king's son is dead. Now, what David is doing, David desperately wants to hear something like, oh yeah, they had a standoff, and they ended up surrendering, and there was a peaceful agreement, and Absalom surrendered, and David was wanting something like this, some kind of news that Absalom was still alive. David needed to hear the outcome of the war, but Joab knows that Ahimaaz is not the good guy to take the message back to David that his son has been slaughtered. Ahimaaz was the son of Zadok, one of the high priests, because there were two guys that were high priests at this time, Abiathar and Zadok, and each of them had a son that apparently was a messenger. As one writer explains, that the choice of a messenger to the king depended upon the content of the news. Was the news good or bad? Ahimaaz was confident that the news was good, because David's enemy is dead. But Joab knew that David was more interested in Absalom's welfare than the outcome of the battle. So you have these professional messengers. These guys were runners, okay, and that's what they did. So each of the high priests has a son who is you might say, some kind of a marathon runner that had been used in the past to bring messages for the battlefield. And Ahimaaz, his father is Zadok, a really, really godly guy that is highly dedicated to King David. He wants to go and bring the one to bring the news back, but Joab says, I'm not quite sure how David's going to respond to this. He may fly off the handle and just kill you for bringing bad news. So, no, you're not the guy. Instead, verse 21, Joab said to the Cushite. Cush, well, okay, that's somebody from Africa. Cush is basically Central Africa, kind of like down Ethiopia region. And it doesn't even name who the guy's name is. It just calls him the Cushite. If you ever want to know in a movie, who's the guy that's going to die? It's the guy that you never get to know his last name, It was Bob, So this guy, the Cushite, he's the one that is chosen. Go tell the king what you've seen. So the Cushite bowed to Joab and ran. Now Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said once more to Joab, whatever happens, please let me also run after the Cushite. And Joab said, why would you run, my son, since you'll have no reward for going? But whatever happens, Ahimaaz said, I will run. So he said to him, well, run. Now Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and passed up the Cushite. So Joab has appointed this Cushite, this foreigner, a very dedicated foreign soldier that is a messenger. Joab says, you're going to be the one to tell the king about everything that happened. Ahimaaz says, no, I'm going to go too. And Joab says, fine, go ahead and go. He outruns the Cushite. And the reason why he wanted to go, I would say this. Why did Ahimaaz want to go? He loved the Lord. 2, he loved his kingdom. And he loved David. David, he messed up in some of these things. But he was a good guy. He was a really, really good guy. So Ahimaaz, wants to be part of this. So they both run. Verse 24. Now David was sitting between the two gates in Mahanaim, and the watchman went up to the roof of the gate by the wall, and raised his eyes and looked, and behold, there was a man running by himself. That's Ahimaaz in first place. One thing is clear, David was very eager for news, He's sitting in between the two gates of the city, which was a major place for hanging out and doing business. Verse 25, the watchman from up on the top calls out and tells the king, and the king says, well, if he's by himself, that's good news. And he came nearer and nearer. Then the watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called to the gatekeeper and said, behold, another man is running by himself. And the king said, yeah, this one's bringing good news too. I mean, he just wants to hear that somehow Absalom is still alive. The watchman said, I think the one that is in first place, this looks like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. I mean, he must have been distinctive enough in the way that he would run that you could say, yeah, that's who this guy is, even from a distance. And the king said, this is a good man. So he's coming with good news. Well, news is coming. Verse 28, Ahimaaz called and said to the king, Shalom. Everything's good. All is well. And he prostrated himself before the king with his face to the ground. And he said, blessed is the Lord your God, he says to David, who has delivered up the men who lifted up their hands against my lord the king. The king said, is it well with the young man Absalom? Ahimaaz answered, when Joab sent the king's servant, your servant, in other words, when he sent me, your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what it was. And then the king said, turn aside and stand here. So he turned aside and stood still. So Ahimaaz tells David, the war is over and you have won the war, but he doesn't tell him the outcome. Verse 31, behold, the Cushite arrived, and the Cushite said, let my lord the king receive good news, for the Lord has freed you this day from the hand of all those who rose up against you. Good news, you won the war. Still doesn't tell him what the outcome was. Verse 32, the king said to the Cushite, is it well with the young man Absalom? And the Cushite answered, let the enemies of my lord the king, let all who rise up against you for evil be as that young man. Well, you don't have to be too sharp to understand what this means. Your son has received the consequences that he deserved. He's dead. David understood this. Verse 33, the king was deeply moved, which means probably the word here, ragaz, means that he just began to tremble and shake. We do see, it looks like David is probably about 60 years old at this point, and he ruled on the throne until he was 70. And you remember that when he got to a couple years down the road, he had what appears to be Parkinson's, maybe Parkinson's, because he had a condition where he would just, tremble and shake uncontrollably. So, we don't know. He may have already kind of been coming over this, but when he heard the news that, your son has been slaughtered, he was overcome, deeply moved, shaking, went into his room over the gate, and he wept. And as he walked around, all he would say is, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would that I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son. He was overcome. And again, that's his son. And he's also, no doubt, he's also reflecting upon what Nathan the prophet told him earlier when Nathan confronted him after, David and Bathsheba, and, Uriah. And he said, God is going to raise up evil from within your own household, and it's going to stick with you for the rest of your life. God's not going to strip the kingdom from you. He's not going to take your life, but you are going to have some really painful consequences coming from your own family. And David has to be looking at these things right now and saying, this is all my fault. This is all my fault. One writer says, David's deep and irrational grief proves how real God's punishment foretold by Nathan had been. And this writer says, its chief purpose here is to emphasize this point. So David was a good guy. We can't look back and say, oh, David was a terrible guy. He wasn't a terrible guy. He was a good guy. Made some stupid moves that caused a lot of trouble. But he wasn't a bad guy. He was a great man of God. But even great people can make bad decisions. And in this case here, it's a bad decision driven by a good motive. I love my son, and I want to see him live. Well, chapter 19, David is not handling this well at all. And Joab says, okay, we can't let this go on. Joab probably was not surprised at David's response. I mean, he would have expected that because he knew David really, really well. I mean, Joab was there in these situations when, David could have killed Saul on the spot, and David said, I am not going to kill the king. So Joab has watched him his whole life and knows, what an upright character David has. So this doesn't surprise him, but Joab knows that this can't continue. As one writer explains it, wars, and especially civil wars, may achieve an aim at a moment, but inevitably they give rise to new problems. This is creating another opportunity for a civil war and another revolution. So verse 20, chapter 19, verse 1. Then it got told to Joab, behold, the king is weeping and mourns for Absalom. And the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people. For the people heard it and said, the king is grieved for his son. They just had a massive victory to save the kingdom of Israel. This was big. And David is getting everybody depressed by crying about the chief enemy. Eugene Merrill says, so chagrined were David's soldiers, they slipped out of Mahanaim and went back home as losers instead of winners. It should have been saying, yes, God has saved the kingdom, and yet everybody's just saying, man, I'm out of here. I'm going home. Verse 3, so the people went by stealth into the city that day, as people who are humiliated steal away when they flee in battle. The king covered his face and kept crying out with a loud voice, oh, my son Absalom! Oh, Absalom, my son, my son! We understand his grief, but he was not thinking well. Well, Joab knows that this can't continue, so verse 5, Joab came into the house to the king and said, today you have covered with shame the faces of all your servants, who today have saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters, the lives of your wives, the lives of your concubines, by loving those who hate you, by hating those who love you. For you have shown today that princes and servants mean nothing to you. For I know this day that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead, you'd be pleased. He laid it out to David, exactly as needed to be said, because David was just blowing it. This is why it's good to listen to advice from people who care about you and listen to advice. Now, somebody may give you advice that you say, no, that's not the best thing to do, But if you listen, you can process things, and if you listen to enough people, hopefully we can get the right mixture of things that will help us to think things out. So Joab is spot on right here and telling David how bad he's out of line. David, and Joab is right, you're crying about a wicked murder getting what he deserved. And it just is so strange the way that we see this exact kind of thing happening over and over in our own country today. There's a murder trial going on right now. It just started a couple days ago. And, a couple high school kids. And one of them just stabbed the other kid to death. And now there are like mobs of people celebrating the guy that committed the murder and, championing him. And they've raised like $500,000 for him, We have a society that for different reasons doesn't want to say that person was evil. They need to be put to death right now. Because biblically speaking, that's what you get in these kinds of situations. There's a whole lot of the crime in our country, and my opinion, okay, which doesn't mean it's good, but we shouldn't waste trial money and time on some of these things. It's like, no, that guy needs to die right now. There's no question this person, what they did. Matter of fact, this guy that did that murder said, hey, I'm not the alleged killer. I did it. Anyhow, David is like taking the side of Absalom because of misplaced affection, but he was completely wrong. Joab sets him straight in verse 7 and told him that he needs to go out and be the leader of the people. Verse 7, now therefore arise, David, go out and speak kindly to your servants, for I swear by Yahweh, if you do not go out, surely not a man will pass the night with you, and this will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now. If you don't stop this right now, you're going to have the worst problem, and we're not going to get around it this time. We were able to win by God's grace this situation, but if you don't stop this, there's going to be a revolution, and you're going to lose the kingdom. David listened, verse 8, so the king arose and sat in the gate. When they told all the people, saying, behold, the king is sitting in the gate, then all the people came before the king. Now all Israel, they had fled each to his tent. So he's not handled it well, but when Joab confronted him, he had the sense to say, okay, I'll go out and I'll be among the people. And of course we know that he did remain on the throne. And eventually Solomon came to the throne, and life went on. Let me summarize for you. I've kind of hit on some of these principles of decision making, but I'm going to recap them and give you a couple more of them. So what was number one on the list about making good decisions? Be right with God, okay? Huh? Yeah, you're right. That is before the whole thing. Don't be stupid. Just in your own mind, no hands raised. Can you think of things like, oh, that was really stupid. I should not have done that. So, number one, be right with God. Be saved and be walking with the Lord. Second principle, and there's 10 principles for biblical decision making. Now, this is not new. I've sent this to some of you before. If you want my notes up to this point, or if you want that document, I'll happily send out this. It's kind of a helpful summary on decision making. Number one, be right with God. I call that participation. They're all P's. It's a series of principles, all starting with P. It is a plethora of P's. So the first one is participation in the life of Christ by being saved and walking with him. The second principle is called precepts. Look at what the Bible's commandments are about whatever it is, If I said, man, I'm really broke, I need some money, I'm going to go down and rob 7-Eleven after church tonight. No, you know that's wrong, okay? There's a commandment about that. The third principle is principles. If you don't have a direct commandment about something, look at the broader principles, because many times there are things that we get faced with and we don't have a direct commandment, but there are principles involved with it. So that's number 3, is principles. The fourth P is people, and by people what I mean is this. Listen to advice from other people, godly people. Listen to advice. And if they're an expert in some area, like military, listen to your military generals. If you're building a building, listen to people who are experts at construction. And they don't have to necessarily be Christians to give you good advice. Number 5 is prayer. Every Christian should pray about the things of life, but what we don't want to do is say, well, I prayed about this, so I really have peace about divorcing my wife. Your wife doesn't want a divorce. Well, I prayed about it. I have peace. Yeah, some people basically say, I prayed about it, and then they use that as somehow oh, everything is cool. But pray, for God to work, and you can always pray that God would work in a way that accomplishes what he knows is good and best, okay? Number 6, here's the 6th principle, what I call passions. And by passions, it's the only word I could think of with a P that relates to this. I'm talking about desires of the heart. Now, in the Bible, it says that he who follows his own heart is a fool. But it also says in another passage, delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. So desires in themselves are not necessarily right or wrong. There can be good desires. And if you say, I really have a heart for this ministry or something like that, that's great. So passions are part of it. But, you can't be driven by your desires, your passions. It has to be, all of these things kind of have to be in submission to everything that precedes it. Here's a 7th principle, what I call providence, which is the idea that we should look at circumstances of life and take into account how circumstances of life are unfolding. Circumstances may be helpful in seeing what we should do, but it's no certain assurance. You don't want to do something like say, well, I was walking down the sidewalk and I saw some rocks on the sidewalk and I knew that God wanted me to be a rock star. Now you laugh at that, but there is somebody that I had lunch with a few years ago with another brother from the church, and that effectively is how the guy said he makes his decisions. And I said, is that how you live your life? And he says, oh yeah. Not good. But if you look at circumstances, can circumstances sometimes be a very helpful key in making good decisions? Yeah. So, opportunity opens up. You know what? This is really good providential opportunity. So take into account circumstances. That's number 7. Here's an 8th principle. It's what I call preference. The concept of preference deals with the fact that we are free to choose that which has not been explicitly forbidden or commanded. What I mean is this. Adam, Eve, Adam comes home from his first day at the office. Eve, what's for dinner? She goes, I don't know. I have to ask God what we can eat. Now, she didn't have to do that because God already said, from any tree of the garden, you may freely eat. Except that one, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So they were free to choose. Matter of fact, MacArthur wrote a book on decision-making in the will of God, and it was called Free to Choose. If you have something that is not forbidden, there's not a commandment tied to it, you can choose whatever you want. I want to buy a house. Should I buy the red house at this end of the block or the blue house? Whichever one you want is fine. Now, there may be some wisdom at work in this thing because you find out that one of the houses, has a disaster of, a plumbing problem or something like that, and you go, I don't want anything to do with that, okay? So wise decisions to look at circumstances. But what I'm getting to is this, that when we make decisions, okay, we're doing an expansion on the foyer so that we can have bathrooms on the top floor. There's some really good principles at work in trying to get that foyer expanded and have bathrooms right there. But, this church went 60 years without having that. We didn't have to do this. I think it was smart for us to do that. So you try to look at wise decisions based upon circumstances. Preference, we're free to choose. Here's number 9. I call it priority. And by that, I mean this. We should really try to make decisions, I think, that give spiritual priority, spiritual expediency on how we can serve God with our life. For example, you say, man, I want to live on Gilligan's Island, It's paradise. Eat coconut cream pie for the rest of your life. Piece of cake, easy life. But how are you going to serve God, So when I say priority, and I have an expression that I call spiritual expediency, what kind of decision are you faced with that will give you the opportunity for serving God? And if you have something that is not going to contribute to the way that you serve God in your life, then maybe you shouldn't do it, Think about, how can I make a difference? Because our life is a vapor. And if we're not serving God, we're not doing what we should. Number 10, what I call perseverance. Sometimes we have desires that are good, and we want to do something, and we have a desire that's good, and you just don't get the answers to your prayer. Well, maybe a matter of timing. Sticking with it, keep praying for, what you want to do. Maybe you have some ministry desire, but it just the door won't open. If it's a good thing, keep pursuing it. Sometimes it's a matter of God's timing, and what you and I just need to do is persevere in following the Lord, serving the Lord, and see how His door opens, And that's what I got to say about that. Just as I was closing with that thought about perseverance, many of you will remember not Catherine Leake, but Lisa Newland, who served with us for, I think, about 8 years. And was she in Zambia? Tanzania. Yeah, I remember that now. Lisa, I think at TZ, Tanzania. And so she came back off the field about 6 or 7 years ago or something like that, gave 8 years of her young life to serve God. Anyhow, her husband died a few days ago. She was married to a guy named Tim Egler. And they lived up in Woodland Park, and I just saw that, Tim had some disease and, died, which is really heartbreaking. But I don't know if you know Lisa or not, but you can reach out to her. Sometimes things just don't work out the way that we would like. Keep serving God. Amen. Father, we thank you for your kindness to us in this time where we could focus our hearts upon you and be reminded about following you and serving you. Thank you for this time in Jesus' name. Amen.
You gave the example of that teenager. The money's been raised for him because they think he's innocent.
Oh, yeah.
And then there's the guy Luigi that shot that CEO, healthcare CEO in the back of the head. Millions of dollars have been raised for his defense.
It's crazy.
Because people think, well, he did a good thing, shooting a guy that's a CEO
President of an
a
insurance
healthcare
company, yeah. Yeah, it's really crazy where our country's at.
It is.
Yeah, that's I know. It's evil good and good evil, And, I don't know. I get anxious when I look at the news. MacArthur said before then, stop looking at the news, But you see, what's happening within your culture, and, these things like going back to the one in North Carolina where the guy just walks up and stabs that Ukrainian girl and to death, It's like, and then they say, oh, no, he's not competent to stand trial. He's competent to get on a train. Anyhow, it's just crazy. Yeah, hey, have a good week, and God bless you.